Imagine a witness who recalls an extraordinary event. They're very confident, sincere. They're a reliable witness. Their recall is vivid and detailed. This may be an event of a crime, a UFO, an unidentified object in the sky, a ghost or a Bigfoot sighting, or some other rare or weird event. How reliable is the testimony of such a witness? Also, think of your most cherished childhood memory. Chances are the memory is almost entirely a fiction. I know most people don't want to think that their memories can be so unreliable or flawed, but that's my task during this lecture, is to convince you of how utterly flawed human memory is. Like perceptions, memory is not a passive recording. We don't have tape recorders in our head. Our memories are constructed. They are constructed entirely by our brains. They are, in fact, part of our internal narrative. They're tied together with everything that we think and everything that we believe, with our internal model of reality. There are various different types of memory. For example, there's short-term memory, a several-minute window of memory. The anatomical structure in our brain where that occurs is called the hippocampus. There is also working memory. Working memory is our ability to hold a few bits of information in our minds and manipulate it in some way. So when you're adding a couple of numbers together, you're using your working memory to hold on to those numbers and do the calculation. There is also long-term memory. Long-term memory, as the name implies, are stored more diffusely throughout the brain for a long period of time. This lecture will focus almost entirely from this point forward on long-term memory. But actually, before I begin to tell you how terrible our memory is, it is worth pointing out that human memory can be incredibly powerful. There is a classic experiment which was recently replicated by a colleague of mine, Richard Wiseman, who is a psychologist, in which they take two subjects and expose them over a few days to 10,000 different photographs. They then showed them photographs and asked them whether that was one of the 10,000 photographs they had recently witnessed or not. And the subjects, on average, were able to correctly identify 68% of the 10,000 photographs that they were recently exposed to. So in terms of raw capacity, and in terms of just being familiar with objects that we have seen, especially visual memory, human memory can be quite powerful. Although, again, there are lots of ways in which it has limits. The limits of human memory are not just with recall. We tend to have an innate sense that our only problem with memory is recall. That's because we feel like we have difficulty remembering something, but then it may pop into our mind that we suddenly have access to that memory. That leads to this false assumption that all problems with memory are recall problems, but that's not the only problem at all. Some memories never form. We may experience something but never consolidate it from short-term into long-term memory. Memories also degrade over time. There is actual loss of information. It's not just difficult to access the memory is actually not there anymore. But even worse than just pure recall, our memories can fuse together. Two different memories can be fused into one memory, or they morph. The memories change over time. They alter in details and in generalities over time. But let's talk about recall first. There is one type of long-term memory that is called a flashbulb memory. This is a memory that we have for an unexpected emotional event, as opposed to the everyday mundane events of our lives, what you had for breakfast. Flashbulb memories tend to be vivid. They tend to be very long-lasting memories, and they are reinforced by the emotion of the event. In fact, a strong emotional experience does strongly reinforce a memory. We tend to remember emotional things more than events that do not carry with them emotions. And specifically traumatic events are generally lead to very strong long-term memories. There is a 1992 study by Nesser and Harsh where they questioned 106 students right after the Challenger explosion. So what they experienced when they heard that the Challenger, the space shuttle that exploded as it was launching, when they heard that represents a flashbulb memory, a sudden, unexpected, and emotionally laden event. They then re-questioned 44 of the 106 students 2.5 years later. Those are the ones that were available for follow-up. And they scored those students on the accuracy of their memory of where they were and what they were doing during the Challenger explosion 2.5 years earlier. That's not that much time. 2.5 years is a fairly recent long-term memory. 25%, 1/4 of those students scored 0 out of 7 in terms of details, accuracy for details of that flashbulb memory. Half scored 2 or less. Recall in general in the entire group was very bad. And it wasn't an all or nothing problem. It's not as if the students either remembered everything that they were doing or had no memory for the event. Most had some memory, but their memory for the details was simply appalling. This type of experiment was replicated with the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks. Tallarico and Rubin did a similar flashbulb memory recall study. They found that the accuracy and consistency of everyday and flashbulb memories degraded equally over time. So they took the prior study one step further. They not only assessed the accuracy of a dramatic flashbulb memory, the 9/11 events, but they also had the subjects recall everyday events, like what they had done a couple of days before, and then they compared the ability to recall the two types of memory, everyday versus flashbulb. They degraded it at the same rate over time. However, subjects with everyday memories, their confidence also decreased at about the same rate as their accuracy did. But for the flashbulb memories, their confidence remained high, and the memories remained vivid and emotional. So the memories differed in those two respects. Now, interestingly, the confidence in the memory was not a good predictor of the accuracy of the memory. We tend to naively assume that if we're very confident in a memory, if it feels vivid to us, if we can recall it easily, it must therefore be accurate. But the research does not bear that out. They were uncertain if the results from similar or distinct processes. In other words, what causes us, how do we assess our own confidence in our memories versus how do we form those memories in the first place? So it's still not certain if that's the same process or if there's a distinct neurological process somewhere else in the brain where we assess our confidence in our memories. Memories of details tend to increase confidence. But having a vivid memory for detail, it does not necessarily predict accuracy. So again, this can result in the overall result of all this is a vivid memory that you feel very confidently about, but which is extremely inaccurate, perhaps even 0 out of 7 in terms of its accuracy. Overall familiarity did not increase confidence that much, but better correlated with accuracy in some experiments. So the overall familiarity with the memory may predict accuracy a little bit. Vivid recall of details, not so much. The bottom line of all of this is that confidence itself is not a good predictor of accuracy. In relation to the disconnect between accuracy and confidence, there is also something with which memory psychologists call source amnesia. How often do you say, or do you hear someone else say, "I read somewhere" or "I heard somewhere," and then they relay some fact or some story? We have a particularly bad memory for the source of information, even when we can recall the information itself. So it's interesting to think that our brains simply do not dedicate a lot of resources, a lot of memory resources, in order to note what the source of information is. Perhaps it wasn't that big a deal in terms of our everyday survival in what we would call the evolutionary milieu, living in tribes on the African plains, for example. But now in our much more complicated civilization where we're dealing with multiple sources of information and we have to assess the sources, the reliability of a source of information in order to say something meaningful about that information itself, this source amnesia is a major problem. Knowing that you heard something somewhere just is not that helpful if you have no way of assessing how reliable the source was because you don't remember the source. Similar to source amnesia is truth amnesia. We remember a claim much more easily than we remember the distinct fact of whether or not that claim is a myth. There is now the famous Skumic et al. Study of 2005, which showed that as many as 27% of young adults misremembered a false statement as being true only 3 days after they were told. And 40% of older adults misremembered a false statement as true. They remembered that they had heard the statement before, but they didn't remember that it was false. They didn't remember the truth aspect of that claim. So truth status appears to fade faster than familiarity, as does source status. Familiarity leads, therefore, to a truth bias, which gets reinforced with repetition. This is even worse. The effect of not remembering the truth status of a claim is worsened when the truth status is not revealed until the end. This has a lot of implications for myth-busting, for information campaigns. So, for example, if we say that this specific claim is a myth, it's a myth that there is a causal link between vaccines and autism. What people remember is that, I remember something about vaccines and autism. I don't remember what the details were. They don't remember that it's a myth. They don't remember where they heard it from. They just have this familiarity with this association between vaccines and autism. Recently, it was in the news that there was concerns about apple juice and arsenic. It turns out when you investigate the details that there's no concern, that the levels are well below safety limits. But now it's out there in the public. Yeah, there's something about apple juice and arsenic. They may not remember where they heard it from. They may not remember the details that the FDA said the levels are well below safety limits and that it's really a non-issue. But they just remember that there's something out there. Psychologists also distinguish thematic versus detail memory. These are also different types of memory that we have for an event. By thematic, we mean the gist of the overall event, its overall emotional content. Again, to use an example from our evolutionary history, if you go to a certain location and there's a predator there of some sort, all you may remember is, when I was in that location, there was something dangerous there that made me afraid. I don't want to go back to that location unless I absolutely have to. You may not remember all the details of exactly what kind of predator, exactly what happened. The gist of the memory is enough for you to act upon it in a survival way, in a meaningful way. In fact, there are different brain patterns for each of these types of memory. We can look at functional MRI scanning, which is a way of imaging real-time brain activity. And we can have people remember the themes of a memory of an event versus focusing on remembering specific details. And different parts of their brain will light up during those different types of memory tasks. So remembering details is neurologically, it's anatomically different than remembering the theme of a memory. We also tend to focus on stimuli and ignore peripheral details. For example, a witness will tend to remember the weapon that an alleged assailant was holding. They tend to focus on an emotionally laden detail. They remember that he was holding a gun. And they remember, again, the emotional gist of the event, that there was an assailant, he was holding this weapon, and he was threatening. But then when the police asked them to remember details, what color was his eyes, what was he wearing, what was the color of his clothes, those kind of details, they may not remember those details at all. So here there's this trade-off between remembering the emotional gist of an event and remembering the details. And unfortunately, we're simply not very good at remembering details. But the situation's even much worse than that. It's much worse than just the fact that we don't have a good memory for details. We're very good at familiarity. We're good at thematic gist. We're bad at details. But worse than that, we actually alter the details. This gets back to the notion I described earlier that memories are not passive, they're constructed. When you remember a memory, you're not just experiencing this stored memory. You're actually reconstructing the memory as you recall it. You're updating the memory. You're bringing it up to date with everything that you learned since the last time you remembered or thought of that memory. We construct a narrative, a story in our heads about what happened to us in the past, what is happening in the world. And that narrative has emotions and themes to it, and we actually alter the details in order to be in line with our narrative, the thematic narrative. If we think that we remember an event where an assailant was being threatening, we may remember them as being larger than they were, being more threatening than they were. We may even remember them doing things that they didn't do, but that are all in line with the emotional theme of the memory. So details are not only inaccurate, they're biased thematically. We invent details and we change details in order to make a story more emotionally punchy. Here is an excellent example that is fairly well documented. Jane Hill was a famous witness to the JFK assassination. She was standing very close to the vehicle when the shots were fired. We have recorded her report on the day of what she saw, as well as photographic and other video evidence for corroboration. Yet her story slowly morphed over the years to fit the narrative theme that she had developed of a conspiracy, that there was more than one shooter there. Initially, her reports were very simple. She said that she saw nothing. She was standing next to the car when the shots ran out. She saw what happened to the president, but otherwise she didn't really see a thing, is what she said. But then over the years, she started to embellish her story. She began to add details that maybe she saw something over at the grassy knoll. And then years later, she saw a person over at the grassy knoll. Eventually, she even recalled running down a person, running after a person who was trying to flee the scene from the grassy knoll. These details were all added bit by bit over years each time she was interviewed. She remembered the gist of the event, and she remembered the narrative that was developed, that there was a conspiracy of multiple shooters, and then the details morphed over the years, documented on multiple interviews, to fit that narrative, completely disconnected from the reality of what she actually saw as documented immediately after the event. Past events become, in this way, contaminated, and researchers talk about memory contamination. We incorporate details that we are exposed to after an event into the memory of the event itself. Researcher Loftus et al. Studied thousands of subjects and found that people incorporate misleading details from questions or other accounts into their own visual memory. So, for example, you show subjects a film of something happening, and then just by asking them leading questions, what was the woman in the video wearing? When in fact, let's say there was no woman in the video, but you're asking them about a woman, so they think, all right, there must have been a woman there. Why else would you be asking them about a woman? Therefore, they remember seeing a woman, and they invent details. They can tell you what she was wearing. They can see the details. They remember them vividly. These are false memories that were constructed easily just by asking a slightly leading question. There is also a need to conform to what we think we know about the event we're trying to recall. Witnesses therefore tend to contaminate each other's accounts, bringing them in line with each other. Now, all of this is not deliberate deception going on. These witnesses are all honest and sincere. This is just how our memory works. In order to keep all of our memories consistent, we update the details so that they all fit together. And if we have to alter or make up details of a memory in order to do that, our brains happily do that to fill in any gaps, gloss over any inconsistencies. So at the end, we have a consistent narrative, even though it may be completely inaccurate. UFO witnesses, therefore, if you have 3 or 4 people who all witnessed the same unexpected, unusual event, light in the sky, as it were, they may all give a very consistent account, and that consistent account may be interpreted as evidence that they experienced something real. However, if they talked with each other about what they saw, they have contaminated each other's memory, and now they will have incorporated the details that the other persons suggested to them into their own memory. And their memory, they may have vivid, detailed memories of seeing things that were simply the result of the communication they had among them. We can even make up details entirely. We tend to invent details to fill in the gaps in order to create a consistent story and reinforce the emotional themes. This gets back to the fact that memory is a construction. It's not a passive recording. We are constructing memories. And our brains have to do this in many trivial ways. For example, when we blink, we miss a little bit of visual information, and our brains stitch together the visual information so we have one continuous stream. Well, we do that cognitively as well. We stitch together the different bits of things that we perceive about an event and that we remember about an event, and we stitch it together in a thematic narrative, and we fill in all the gaps. This is called confabulation. We make up details as needed in order for the narrative to be seamless. There are lots of experiments into the human tendency for confabulation. For example, there's one famous study in which there is a staged theft. You go to a public area where there are a couple of confederates. Confederates are subjects that are participating in a psychological study. They're carrying out the scenario. And a person simply says, "Hey, somebody stole my radio." And then police officers who are also Confederates come in and they take eyewitness testimony. People who were there will describe the radio. They will describe a suspicious person who probably took it, when in fact there never was a radio. No one ever came in and took it. The entire scenario was made up. But the witnesses were told there was a radio. They were told it was stolen. They're being asked to recall what happened, so they invent all the details they need to in order to make the narrative make sense. There is also what's called forced confabulation, where leading questions are asked, say, about a film that was viewed. A week later, subjects can remember seeing a non-existent scene that was never in the film that they were asked about. So again, we make up these details to fill in our internal narrative, and they become indistinguishable from quote-unquote real memories. A memory of something we made up or confabulated feels like a memory of something we really experienced. We don't have a way of telling the difference. This is sometimes referred to as the Rashomon effect. This is based upon a 1950 Kurosawa film about a rape and murder where the same story was told from 4 different accounts, and it was a very artistic depiction of how different accounts can be. Everyone has their own perspective, their own filter, and their own memory. And therefore, when they compare notes later, there may be striking differences in how they each constructed the same event that they were all experiencing at the same time. You probably have experienced this yourself many times. Imagine a time when you had a very heated argument or discussion with other people over a course of 30 minutes or an hour or so, you may have been heatedly discussing something. And then afterwards, when things have calmed down and you're comparing notes about who said what, you may find that you and the others have very different accounts about what just happened previously. You might even say, oh, I wish we had a camera rolling when this conversation was happening, because what you're claiming now is completely not what happened. But you have to recognize that your memories are as biased, constructed, and flawed as everyone else's in the room, and that's why none of them fit together. You all had different perspectives and different filters. The ability to confabulate can lead to what we call false memories. In 1988, Ellen Bass and Laura Davis wrote a book called The Courage to Heal. In this book, they promoted the idea that there is an epidemic of what they call the repressed memory syndrome. They believe that many people, mostly women, were abused as children, often sexually abused, and even the victims of bizarre, ritualistic, satanic torture. They felt that the memories of these highly traumatic events were repressed, and that they manifested themselves later on in life as adults as anxiety, depression, and eating disorders or other problems. What they created, however, Bass and Davis, was an epidemic of what is now known as false memory syndrome. Therapists who followed their prescription, in fact, encouraged clients to remember details of abuse. They said the first thing you have to do is recognize that your eating disorder or whatever is a manifestation of a childhood abuse. They started with that premise. And they said, I want you to imagine yourself being abused, what was happening, imagine the details, who was doing it. They essentially came up with a very good prescription for manufacturing false memories. And this led to many, many thousands of people manufacturing these memories of intense abuse as children and believing that they were real. They, again, having these confabulated memories. In fact, there were cases of people who were sentenced to prison for committing abuses when the only evidence against them was from so-called recovered memory or false memory. Bud Hopkins is another example of how easy it is to innocently or naively manufacture false memories. Hopkins is a painter who became an amateur UFO abduction investigator. And his research technique was to use hypnosis to interview subjects who suspected that they may have been abducted by aliens. Usually what happened is somebody would read a book or watch a TV show about alien abductions and say, I wonder if I was abducted. I had some unusual experience, or I saw a UFO once. And some of these people may have found themselves in the hands of somebody like Bud Hopkins, who used hypnosis in order to recover what he believed was their partially repressed or erased memory of their alien abduction. Under hypnosis, which essentially is a condition in which people are highly suggestible, even more so than normal, he would ask a series of very leading questions where he would encourage them to imagine themselves being abducted. It's therefore not surprising that a standard abduction scenario would emerge out of those hypnosis sessions, and then his clients would come to really remember being abducted by aliens. But there's every reason to think that these were just another form of false memory. It's so easy to create false memories, in fact, that you could do so just by giving people a simple word list and having them memorize the list. You can give them very subtle suggestions by just having a theme to the words on the list. And then you show them another list that has words that were not on it, but they are similar to words that were on the list, or they're in the same theme. So if you, for example, give subjects a list of 10 different kinds of fruit, and then you show them another list later on, all of fruit, but with different kinds of fruit on the list, they may remember seeing the types of fruit that they hadn't seen. They constructed a false memory of seeing those words because thematically it fits with the theme of the words that they were given. Children are particularly susceptible to suggestibility and creating false memory. There's also often social demands and other motivational factors that may cause us to bring our memories in line with what's being suggested to us. There are false experiences as well that are very easy to generate. Now, a study was able to produce a false memory of subjects eating popcorn just by exposing them to vivid imagery of others doing the same thing. So, for example, if they read an advertisement for a new brand, a false brand of popcorn that describes it vividly as how it tastes and how it feels, and then a week later they were asked whether they were actually given the popcorn to taste or whether it was just described to them, a certain percentage of the people who were never exposed to the popcorn will remember having eaten it themselves. They incorporated the vivid description and they inserted themselves into the events that they read about. We do have, that is a tendency that psychologists have now described, and this is an example of it, the tendency to insert ourselves into memories that we recall. Now, this is a caution for any profession that must elicit a history. So police officers, physicians, therapists, any time where you're soliciting a history from another person, you need to remember the incredible tendency for suggestibility and creating false memories. This is why, like for example, as a physician, I always teach medical students that when you begin to take a medical history, you should never ask leading questions. You need to ask open-ended questions and let patients fill in the details themselves. If you ask leading questions like, are you having a pain in your left shoulder, you're going to generate a certain amount of suggestible false positives from that. Further, not only do we need to avoid encouraging people to invent memories, we need to make sure there's always some external physical corroboration. Courts, in fact, are moving in this direction. More and more caution about the validity of eyewitness testimony and recognition of the need to validate any testimony with some kind of objective evidence. In conclusion, the way to summarize everything I've discussed is that memories are highly constructed. Every time you remember something, you are recreating the memory, updating it, and changing its details. Memories will change over time. They fade over time. We lose important details like whether or not they're correct. They can fuse one memory to another. We can take one detail from one memory and insert it into another. They morph to fit our internal narrative. And we cannot tell the true memories from entirely false memories or contaminated memories. Our confidence is not a good guide. The bottom line is that it's naive to implicitly trust our own memories. This may be unsettling, but it's an important step to recognize that we need to be realistic and humble about the limitations and flaws of human memory. It will help us avoid wrong conclusions and unnecessary conflict and arguments. How many times have you argued with somebody over your differing memories of an event? You just have to recognize that without external objective verification, you really can't know how accurate the details of your memory are. But by recognizing the fallibility of human memory, that is an important step on the journey towards true critical thinking.